First, I want to talk about the OSAC, or the Organization of Scientific Committees for Forensic Science. This consists of about 25 subcommittees that provide technical leadership that facilitate the development and promulgation of consensus-based documentary standards and guidelines for forensic science. 5 scientific area committees, or SACs, which report to the Forensic Science Standards Board, or the FSSB. In specifics of arson, we have the Fire, Debris, and Explosives Subcommittee. This subcommittee focuses on standards specifically related to the scientific examination and analysis of materials associated with fire and explosion investigations. Now that we know who regulates the analysis or oversees the further development of standards for analyses, let's talk about arson in general. What exactly is arson? Well, by definition, arson is defined as the willful/malicious burning or charring of property. We can see that in its most basic sense, a person that commits arson when they knowingly, by means of a fire or explosive, damage any real or personal property of another without their consent, or damage any real or personal property with intent to defraud an insurer. What we'll see with this arson and arson analyses is that there are several different states and federal laws that may differ from state to state. Many states recognize differing degrees of arson based on such factors, whether or not the building was occupied or whether or not insurance fraud was intended. Some of the less serious arson cases may result in just minor punishments, while other arson cases may result in the death penalty. Arson is handled in various courts throughout the U.S. in many different ways. These states classify arson crimes in different categories or degrees. The more serious categories or the degrees of arson will result in much more strict punishments. Setting fire to an occupied building, for instance, could possibly result in a more severe arson charge than setting fire to an abandoned barn in the countryside. Arson can be investigated by elite law enforcement units while using the most advanced chemical analyses to locate things like the point of origin of the fire. Law enforcement can take months or even years to fully investigate before a case is charged. Law enforcement also looks at the motivation behind the crime. Arson often occurs in domestic violence cases to hide another crime, including murder or some sort of financial gain. Let's take a look at North Carolina. The arson laws of North Carolina classify that the burning of any mobile home or dwelling that is occupied at the time that can be considered first-degree felony, and any dwelling that is unoccupied automatically results as a second-degree felony. North Carolina criminal statutes, sections 14 through 58 through 14-67, specify that other specific structures such as schools, places of business, boats, can often result in felonies, but just with lesser punishments. We can see here that a state like Illinois has completely different laws against arson. The laws against arson in this state specify that the crimes exist only if the real personal property value is over $150. There are buildings like schools or churches that don't have a minimum value for arson to be determined. Illinois can also make the distinction between things like arson and aggravated arson. The difference here for aggravated arson is that the fire must have been set on purpose with intention, and the person was either inside the building or even injured, considering also policemen and firemen were injured as well. Now, in the state of New York, these arson laws can be divided into 3 categories for the purpose of sentencing. These 3 categories can then be divided even further down into 2 more classes. These classes are whether or not the building was occupied at the time or someone was seriously injured. Special consideration is also given if an incendiary device was used in order to start the fire in the building. First-degree arson, which is the most serious arson charge in New York, is parallel with that of first-degree murder and is one of the most serious offenses in the state of New York. If you're convicted of one of these charges, you could spend the rest of your life in prison. On the other end of the spectrum, is 5th degree arson, which is the only arson charge that's technically a misdemeanor and not a felony. California contains many of the United States national parks, especially campgrounds and rural areas, making this a top destination on certain people's travel list. However, all of these attractions do make it more susceptible to things like dangerous wildfires, which could have been done deliberately. California has a few different arson-related crimes and penalties which can vary depending on one's intent and whether or not the harm was caused to individuals or specific types of property. For basic arson to apply, prosecutor, all they have to do is prove that the defendant did act willfully and with intent, set fire or burned or caused someone to be burned, any structure, property, forest, or land. Now, for aggravated arson to apply, a defendant must act with the specific intent to cause injury or property damage and either have a previous conviction of arson within the past 10 years or caused damage and certain losses that excess upwards of $6.5 million. Even if these crimes of arson or aggravated arson don't apply, a person can still be held criminally liable for unlawfully causing a fire, even if it was a reckless act, incidental, and still cause property damage, forest, land, or structure damage. So in order to take a look at the federal law, what we'll actually do is look at the crimes and criminal procedure that are associated with the federal law and arson. What this states is that whoever within the special maritime and or territorial jurisdiction of the United States that willfully or maliciously with intent sets fire to or burns any buildings, structures, vessels, any machinery, or building materials / supplies, any structural aids or appliances that require navigation for shipping, or attempts or conspires to do such an act, shall be imprisoned for not more than 25 years. Fine the greater of the fine under this title or the cost of repairing / replacing any property that is or was damaged, destroyed, or both. If the building or the dwelling had a life of any person be placed in jeopardy, he shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for any terms of years or for life, if not both. So we've taken a look at the groups that regulate or produce standards, methods for analyses of arsons in OSAC and the Fire and Debris Subcommittee. We've also taken a look at some of the federal laws as well as varying state laws and what those require to accuse or what they consider counts as an arson, whether it's willful or accidental, the certain punishments that come along with those acts. But now I want to jump back and take a look at some of the ASTM testing methods. So we know that we have a case of arson. How do we go about testing this? What methods do we use? What types of analyses do we use? Well, specifically, I want to take a look at here in the ASTM testing methods. I want to take a look at these 4 listed for you. The very first one being the standard practice for static headspace, sampling of vapors from fire debris and samples. And then we'll move to the standard practice for the separation of ignitable liquid residues from fire debris by passive headspace. And then finally, we'll end up with the standard practice for separation of ignitable liquid residues from fire debris by dynamic headspace concentration onto an adsorbent tube. The very final one you see here, E1618-14, this is the actual standard test method. So the first 3 are more sample prep, how we go about extracting the sample, extracting the liquid ignitables, whereas this last one is actually how we test by GCMS or gas chromatography mass spectrometry. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these and kind of talk about exactly what the scope is, what type of analysis we're doing, what type of separation we're doing, and where or who that may benefit the most. With ASTM E1388-17, what typically occurs is the headspace of an item is sampled, usually in its original container for analysis by an appropriate technique, in this case, gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The container may be heated prior to sampling to increase certain volatility of any of the ignitable liquid residues. This practice is extremely useful for sampling fire debris to screen for the presence of ignitable liquid residues prior to doing any type of extraction with other techniques. This tends to be the most appropriate for sampling light to medium range ignitable liquids like oxygenates or lacquer thinners and other similar volatile compounds or products, and can be less appropriate for things on the heavier side. This practice is generally less efficient at recovering limited quantities of ignitable liquids than other practices like E1386, E1412, E1413, and even E2154, specifically on the higher boiling compounds. Now let's have a look at ASTM 1412-16, where we use charcoal as an absorption package placed in a sample container to absorb the ignitable liquid residues. This practice is really suitable and successful at extracting ignitable liquid residues over the entire range of certain concentrations. The headspace concentration methods are best used when high levels of sensitivity are required due to the small amount of ignitable liquid residues in the sample. Unlike some other methods of separation concentration, this practice is practically non-destructive. It's very sensitive and capable of isolating quantities smaller than about 1/10 of a microliter of ignitable liquid residues from a sample. One of the more recent ASTM methods regarding fire debris and arson is E14131-19, and this brings into account dynamic headspace. So rather than the static headspace or the liquid extraction, we are now working with dynamic headspace, which is going to drastically increase our sensitivity. What we do is we take some headspace vapors from a closed sample container, and those are collected and concentrated onto an adsorbent tube. By means of a headspace exchange, this tube is either desorbed thermally or solvent diluted prior to doing any type of instrumental analysis. Recover from these fire debris will, depending on some factors like temperature, container size, absorptive material, or volume of the headspace, but this method, due to its increased sensitivity, is most suited for thermal desorption analysis with the thermal desorption auto-sampler. Now that we've covered some of the extraction methods, let's take a look at ASTM E1618-14. This is the actual test method that covers the identification of these residues of ignitable liquids in some of the extracts. Although this test method is suitable for all samples, it is especially appropriate for extracts that contain high background levels of substrate materials or pyrolysis and combustion products. This test method is very suitable for the identification of single compounds, simple mixtures, or non-petroleum-based ignitable liquids. What we see here is all three of these previous sample prep methods concur or coincide with the testing of ASTM E1618-14, and we'll take a little bit further look into what compounds and what identification and classifications come along with this method. So we've covered the specific ASTM methods that are responsible for the separation of the ignitable liquids from whatever the matrix is. And then we've also covered now the test method, exactly how we run this on the GCMS instrument. So we have multiple ways of kind of sampling whatever the material is, whatever the fire debris is, but we have one very specific way on how to run this test. But now that we've run this test and we've figured out, okay, we do have some type of fire debris arson case, we have run the test, but I've got results, but I'm not really exactly sure what these results mean or what these components are, right? So the identification here of the ignitable liquid residue in these samples from a scene can support a field investigator's opinion regarding the origin, where it came from, the incendiary nature, but the identification of these ignitable liquid residues don't necessarily lead to a factual conclusion on what was the nature of the fire debris or the arson case. Further investigation is usually required to determine the legitimate reason for the presence of these ignitable liquid residues. What we can see here, though, is a table of very specific ignitable liquid classifications. So we typically separate these up from light, medium, to heavy. And what you can see here is that as we go through these light carbons, medium carbons, heavy hydrocarbons, we can tell exactly, where they came from, what if they were oxygenated solvents, aromatic products, naphthenic products, paraffinic products, and exactly where they may have come from, whether it's solvents, any type of kerosene, diesel fuel, some jet fuel. So these are how we typically separate these. And this is going to give you a good idea of exactly what separation technique, one of the previous ASTM methods that are going to be required in order to extract the samples, depending on what type of hydrocarbons we're actually interested in seeing. We can even divide or identify these classes even further, separating them into 3 subclasses depending on kind of the boiling point range or their N-alkane range. And what we do is separate these into light, or some of the gasoline target compounds, medium, and heavy. With our light product range, we're typically looking at a range from about C4 to C9. The majority of the pattern occurs across this range, C4 to C9, and we typically don't see any major peaks associated with the ignitable liquids in this range above C11. We also have a medium product range, which typically goes from about C8 to C13, which is somewhat of a narrow range of the products, and the majority of the pattern does occur within this range. And we usually don't see any peaks associated with ignitable liquids below the C7 for these target compounds or above the C14. And these are going to include things like nonane all the way up to dodecane. In between that range is typically where you'll see some of the 1,2,3, 1,2,4 trimethylbenzenes. If it does not fall into any of these categories, there is also a miscellaneous category that is included for ignitable liquids that don't fall into one of the specific major ignitable liquid classification classes. Now, for our heavy product range, we're typically seeing these patterns within the C9 to C20 range, which is a fairly broad range. What we typically see also is just a continuous pattern spanning at least 5 consecutive N-alkanes. Also included in the subclass are narrow range encompassing less than 5 alkanes, ignitable liquid products starting above the C11 group. It may be necessary as well to characterize a product as light to medium or medium to heavy when the carbon number range does not fit neatly into one of the above categories. In certain instances where this is the case, where it doesn't fit in one specific range, typically what is reported is just the carbon number range of the repeating pattern. Now that we've taken a look at the analytes that are identified in order to classify the liquid ignitable fluids, let's take a look at the optimal instrumentation needed for this analysis. Introducing the TD-30, Shimadzu's automated thermal desorption sampler. For the next few slides, we will take some time to identify a few of the features and benefits that make this thermal desorption unit ideal for arson and fire debris analysis. After we finish that, we'll also take a look at some of the performance specs as well, with the real data used and run on the TD-30. The TD-30 was developed as the optimal solution for gas and materials analysis. Its outstanding processing ability and excellent expandability provides strong support for all types of analyses, from work in research departments all the way to quality control. Some of the things that we'll look at is the ability to accommodate 60 samples, its efficient overlap function, high sensitivity for some of the high boiling point components. We'll even take a look at its ability to run the sample with a barcode reader, and more importantly, easy user maintenance and user-friendly design. When we look into the overall design of our TD-30, the first thing you'll notice is the short transfer line. This transfer line connects directly into the side of the GC rather than using a GC inlet. What this means is it provides outstanding processing ability and overall basic functionality. When we take the sample line all the way from the tube to the valve block to the trap, what we see is shortness and no cold points. So the transfer line itself, as long as the trap and the valve heating block heats up to 300 degrees, And what that does is that pretty much eliminates all carryover. As we can see here, DHP in leather, we saw under 0.05% carryover from run to run. This is going to be extremely crucial when we get to look at the heavy components of our arson analysis, some of those larger C chains, those carbon chains, those hydrocarbons. What also is important to notice is that there's very little dead volume in the flow path. So from desorption to injection, there's very little dead volume in the flow path. The TD-30 can accommodate up to 60 samples, leaving you plenty of room for analysis, either overnight or over the weekend. The TD-30 also stacks the sample tubes on top of each other, decreasing the footprint of the TD-30 tremendously. On top of that, while running a batch, there's an overlap feature, which enables the next sample to go ahead and be preheated and prepped during the current GC analysis for whatever sample is running. Say you forgot a tube or wanted to replace a tube or add a tube, there's also a batch pause function, which allows you to pause the batch in the middle of analysis, insert whatever you want, and continue to run that consecutive analysis without altering or causing any issues with the analysis that's currently running. An additional feature of the TD-30 is the barcode reader. This increases the expandability and can support a variety of analyses by allowing you to run barcoded tubes. This barcode reader automatically populates the serial number within the software and continuously updates as the batch progresses. The barcode reader is available and can be used or installed and does not require use for analysis. The TD-30 has a built-in consumable usage counter. When we look at consumables on the TD-30, we think of the trap as well as the O-rings that encompass the tubes. Now, this consumable counter automatically calculates and counts each time you make an injection and adds up the tally for your use. When you reach the upper limit, an error message will flash and allow you to change the consumables. The consumables here being the trap and the Calrez O-ring are the only two consumables that need to be changed, making user maintenance extremely easy and accessible. The consumable usage counter also keeps your instrument happy. While the TD tube is in the TD-30, the tube itself makes 3 points of contact with the desorber. These 3 points of contact have a pressure sensor that allow the TD-30 to monitor the pressure on the tube itself. What this prevents is tubes from breaking within the desorber, creating a mess and causing the analysis to stop. The batch actions also have the ability to skip. So if a tube is not present or if a tube begins to leak during desorption, this tube can either be replaced, skipped, or stopped. The TD-30 software is extremely user-friendly and directly integrates with GCMS solutions. At first, we can see the batch output there on the left top-hand side. This contains the vial number, sample name ID, as well as the method file path. Here is where we have the ability to pause and start the batch from this window. We can also operate the pretreatment actions, whether or not we want to skip, stop, or continue with analysis in the batch. The TD-30 also has a built-in leak check function that allows you to leak check not only the sample tube, but the entire system in line. This allows us to monitor and make sure that our system is completely leak-free at all times. The method editor on the right-hand side lists the parameters, giving you ranges, keeping you from putting in numbers outside of the range. The method parameters of a TD-30 are quite simple due to its thermal desorption properties. We also have a built-in option to condition not only sample tube, but trap. These sample tubes with the 10x material can be conditioned, especially when bought new, should be conditioned, and this can be done automatically by the TD-30 itself. Just simply place the tubes in the TD-30, select condition, and list the number of tubes for how long and how hot you would like to heat them, and this will condition the tubes automatically for you. As the batch continues to run, the TD-30 will proceed through the lines of analysis. What you will see in the bottom right-hand side is that all of the analysis conditions are constantly recorded for each individual run. This includes the minimum and maximum pressure, the flow rate, as well as the tube flow rate, temperatures. This allows us to make sure that the TD-30 is operating properly, as well as the system is leak-free, the tubes are leak-free, and that the system is proceeding as it should with no issues whatsoever. So we've seen all the perks and features and benefits of the TD-30. Now let's take a look at how the actual data looks. Here we see the analysis of an SVOC mix. So we're looking at carbons all the way down from C6 up to the C30 area. Now what we can see also is varying concentrations. So these concentrations are weight-based, all the way up from 100 nanograms down to 5 nanograms. And what we can see is that the TD-30 does an excellent job of not only seeing the low, but the high boiling components as well. And we have increased sensitivity due to the Peltier cooled trap. Not only are we seeing the hydrocarbons extremely low, we're seeing larger molecules like the DEHP, DEP, and some additional phthalates. So the TD-30 has proven to show great chromatography across the board from all low points and high points alike. Here we can see a list of VOC mix components often found in what you might find in a fire debris or arson analysis. If we're taking a look at things like acrylonitrile, the xylenes, as well as the trimethylbenzenes, we can see a lot of the similarities between this VOC mix and some things that we might expect to come off on a fire debris analysis. Now what we see here is a list of components with the average concentration, calculated concentration. This is around a 1 ppm. And we're looking at RSDs here for the area counts. And as you can see, all of the RSDs, especially for the components typically seen in this arson analysis or fire debris analysis, are well below 5%, showing that the TD-30 is not only sensitive enough, but extremely repeatable injection after injection. Here we can see the same list of components in the previous slide, instead with correlation coefficients. These components were prepped in standards with a low point starting at 1 nanogram, with the upper point at 100 nanograms. This was a 5-point calibration curve, used linear fit, and we can see the correlation coefficient for almost all of these components is around 0.999, showing extremely good linearity, reproducibility, and sensitivity on the TD-30. The TD-30 proves to be the perfect tool for any analyst looking to support ASTM E1413-19 using sorbent tubes. With its excellent capability and functionality, batch overlap function, sample capacity of over 60 samples, including its sensitivity and reliability proven in the data with both VOC and SVOC mix, the TD-30 Auto Sampler is a tool any analyst could wish to have when running arson analysis.